The street sign in my office wall says Porter Avenue. Green aluminum, white letters bent at the base where the thermal pulse caught it. It hangs about 2 feet from my desk at shoulder height, sealed inside 18 inches of slag glass like a dragonfly in amber. I used to notice it every morning. Now I notice it as I notice a light switch. I know it's there, but my eyes pass over it without stopping. Same for the rebar. Same for the compressed layers of concrete aggregate that still show the grain of old sidewalk. The shapes deeper in the glass became part of the room too. I had stopped examining them during my 2nd year in this office, because a man who looks too carefully at the walls of the place where he works will eventually see something that makes working there difficult. My name is David Palmer. As Senior Logistics Coordinator for the Tithe Administration in New Geneva, I manage transport schedules, district quotas, medical screening compliance, equipment allocation. I move numbers from one column to another so that 300 young people per cycle move from their districts to transport ships without administrative delay. I have done this for 19 years in this room. 30 years in the administration total. I'm very good at it. 50 years ago, Earth surrendered to the Protectorate. I was 8. My memories begin after the war under Viceroy rule. For all practical purposes, no other world has existed in my lifetime. The occupation is simply the floor the rest of us walk on. Some people spent the first decades pushing against it. The resistance networks in the outer districts, the bombings, the reprisals that followed. The second round of bombings that accomplished nothing except making the reprisals worse. I watched all of that from the trajectory of a young man who was reasonably bright, scored well on the Protectorate's aptitude screenings, spoke when spoken to. By 28, I was inside the Tithe administration. By 34, I had the Ambrosia. The Ambrosia. A weekly injection at the Protectorate clinic, administered by alien medical technicians who handle the needle the way a veterinarian handles a dog, competently, without affection. The treatment reverses cellular aging. It provides enhanced tissue repair. It deposits trace biometric compounds that the Protectorate's security sensors detect passively, so that every time I walk through a doorway or pass a corridor junction, the system logs my position. The side effects are cosmetic. Iridescent veins surface along the jaw, the neck, sometimes the collarbone. Fine blue-green lines visible at close range, shifting color slightly when the light changes. The Protectorate considers them a status indicator. Other humans consider them something else. I am 58 years old. I look roughly 35. I have not been seriously ill in 2 decades. I adjust my collar out of habit when I cross the outer districts, though I rarely do anymore. The walk from the transit station to the wall checkpoint passes through 6 blocks where the veins on my neck are more interesting to the locals than anything I might be carrying. That particular morning, a Tuesday in the 4th week of Tithe prep, I was cross-referencing district submission rosters against the current population registry. Each of New Geneva's 14 districts owed a quota of young adults between 18 and 25, proportional to district population. The numbers had to balance. They always balanced, because I built the allocation formulas myself 12 years ago, but checking the numbers was the job. Checking was what I did instead of thinking about what the numbers represented. Dennis Rowe came in around 9, carrying 2 cups of the grain coffee the commissary served, which tasted like someone had boiled a shoe in weak tea. Dennis was 31. He'd been in the administration 8 years, working under me in transport scheduling. He had the Ambrosia stigma too, fresher than mine, more vivid. The veins at his throat catching the light with that unmistakable blue-green iridescence. He wore open collars. I'd noticed that early. Maybe the veins still felt ordinary to him, or he simply hadn't been doing this long enough to start hiding them. Quota discrepancy in District 9, he said, setting the coffee on my desk. They're short too. 1 death, 1 relocation that didn't get filed until last week. Pull alternates from the supplemental list. Prioritize by proximity to the processing center. Already done. I just need your sign-off on the substitution order. He dug the tablet from under his arm. Also, Nora told me the commissary's getting real coffee next month. Actual beans. I'll believe it when I taste it, but she seemed certain. Nora was the commissary supervisor's wife. Dennis mentioned her approximately once a week in contexts that had nothing to do with work. I suspected he was sleeping with her, or wanted to be, or had been once and was still circling back. Nora belonged to his private life. The substitution order belonged to mine. I reviewed it, signed it, handed the tablet back. Sol wants the updated transit schedule by end of day, Dennis said. Full manifest projections for the new cycle. I'm aware. Just relaying it. He picked up his coffee. I like Dennis. I don't like many people in the administration. Most of the ones I do like, I like for professional reasons. They file correctly. They stay inside their operational lane. They don't generate surprises that become my problems. Dennis I liked because he reminded me of someone, though it took me a long time to figure out who. It was me. The version of me who still believed I could inhabit the system without letting it inhabit me. Prefect Sol's briefing came through on my terminal at 11. Sol was my alien liaison, a senior Protectorate administrator responsible for overseeing the human logistics chain. I'd worked with him for 14 years. The viceroys are tall, narrow-bodied, with segmented thoraxes that give them a posture like a man perpetually leaning forward over a lectern. Sol's face was a smooth, dark plate, with paired sensory apertures where eyes might go. Coordinator Palmer, transit schedule projections. You'll have them by 1700. Current cohort medical clearance rate. 96% of submitted candidates have cleared screening. The remaining 4% are pending secondary evaluation. We'll have full clearance before the intake window. That clearance rate is acceptable. Confirm that docking bay 7 is allocated for the primary transport. Confirmed last week, allocation is standing. The allocation is acceptable. Individual human lives entered Sol's accounting as production totals. Units processed. For 14 years I had heard a viceroy administrator call 300 people per year logistical throughput, then accept each report without question. I accepted the framing because challenging it would have required me to articulate the one I had built for myself. The discrepancy showed up at 4:30, when I was reviewing port docking logs as part of the transit schedule projections Sol had requested. Transport vessel RTG 1138, the primary Tithe carrier for the current cycle, was logged in docking bay 7. It had departed New Geneva 19 days ago, carrying 300 Tithe selectees on what the official documentation described as a transit to the off-world extraction colonies. Round trip to the colonies took 82 days minimum. RTG 1138 had been back in port for 16 days. Filed reason, propulsion failure. The ship turned back after 3 days. Maintenance crews had been working on it since. Fine. Equipment failures happened. Ships came back. The cargo manifest was the problem. 300 people departed on RTG 1138. The ship returned to port 16 days ago with no updated manifest reflecting their status during the layover. 16 days aboard should have generated food requisitions, water reclamation allocation, temporary housing requests, and personnel transfer orders. The manifest omitted every one. 300 human beings were administratively unaccounted for in a facility that logged every crate of mining equipment down to the serial number. My first response was bureaucratic, a paperwork gap. Sol's quarterly audit would flag exactly this kind of discrepancy, and the failure would land on my desk because the transit manifest was my responsibility. I submitted a port access request to inspect the vessel, resolve the manifest status, correct the documentation. The request cleared in 40 minutes. I'd go in the morning. The port facility sat inside the eastern wall of New Geneva, a sprawl of vessel bays, cargo processing hangars, maintenance infrastructure. I had been there perhaps 5 times in 30 years. My work was administrative. It happened at a terminal, in an office, through documents. The port was where documents became physical objects, ships, cargo, bodies, and I had built my career on the comfortable distance between the two. A port technician named Griggs walked me to the secondary maintenance bay where RTG 1138 was docked. Griggs was mid-40s, no Ambrosia, hands that looked like he'd spent decades feeding them into machinery that didn't care about fingers. He kept silent. People without the stigma rarely initiated conversation with people who had it. RTG 1138 was partially disassembled, hull panels removed, drive systems exposed, maintenance scaffolding climbing the fuselage. I entered through the forward maintenance access on my logistics clearance. Griggs stayed outside. I expected a cargo hold configured for human transport, bunks, water reclamation, sanitation, food storage, the basics of a vessel designed to carry 300 living passengers across 82 days of transit. The cargo hold had none of that. Rows of recessed platforms filled the space, each roughly body length, arranged in tight parallel lines with perhaps 18 inches between them. Each platform was fitted with restraint systems, wrist, ankle, torso, molded from a dark composite material I didn't recognize. Above each platform, articulated overhead apparatus extended from ceiling-mounted rails. The platforms were designed for density. I counted rows multiplied by columns. Capacity was well above 300. The surfaces carried biological residue, dried fluid in the restraint grooves, discoloration on the platform surfaces in patterns that mapped to the human body, darker where a torso would rest, lighter at the extremities. I went deeper into the hold, passing through a sealed interior hatch that my logistics clearance opened without difficulty. The compartment beyond was climate-controlled, cold. Inside, preservation units, cylindrical, translucent, arranged in vertical racks. Each unit contained a single organism suspended in pale fluid. I stood in front of one and made myself look. The organism was roughly the size of a human forearm. Segmented. Pale, almost colorless, with a translucent quality to the outer tissue that let me see vascular structures beneath. At one end, a cluster of mouthparts. Along the ventral surface, rows of thin spines, anchoring spines, each perhaps 2 inches long, curved slightly inward at the tip. The thing floated in the preservation fluid without moving. Larvae, dozens of them. The segmented bodies and underdeveloped limbs were unmistakably juvenile, young viceroys, early stage, pre-metamorphic. I found the secondary hold through a maintenance corridor that connected to the main cargo space. The hatch was unsealed. Whatever protocols governed this vessel during transit had been relaxed during the extended maintenance layover. Nobody expected a logistics coordinator to come looking at what was behind the paperwork. 19 of them, still on the platforms. The ship had turned back after 3 days, which meant the process was early. The larvae were small, each one grafted to the upper torso of a human host, anchored between the ribs with those curved spines driven into the intercostal spaces. The graft sites were inflamed, the tissue swollen, discolored to a deep mottled purple where the spines penetrated. The larvae were feeding. I could see where the host tissue had already begun to change, the skin thinning, the underlying musculature losing definition as the organism drew sustenance from it. The hosts were motionless. The wrist straps on several platforms hung loose, unbuckled. The restraints weren't holding them down. Their own bodies were. The mechanism assembled itself in my mind from the components in front of me, like a machine I had studied but never seen operating. The larvae produced something, a secretion, an enzyme. Whatever it was, it locked the voluntary motor system. Total paralysis. The chest still rose with breathing because respiration is involuntary. The heart still beat, the eyes still functioned. One of the larvae contracted while I was watching. The movement traveled along its segments in a slow compression. Its anchoring spines pulled against the flesh between the host's ribs, lifting the skin around each entry point. The young woman's next breath stopped halfway in. Her chest held against the pressure, then released in a shallow spill of air when the organism settled. There was no fastening I could undo. The graft had become the restraint. A young man on the third platform from the left, maybe 20 years old. Brown hair, cut short the way the processing centers cut it before transport. His larva was attached just below the collarbone, its spines buried to the base in his chest wall. His arms lay at his sides, fingers slightly curled, perfectly still. His face was expressionless because expression requires muscle control he no longer had. His eyes tracked me as I walked past. They moved smoothly, following my progress down the row. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. He was watching me the way a man lying at the bottom of a well watches the sky, because it was the only thing his body still allowed him to do. I made it to the end of the row before I vomited. I braced one hand against a support strut. The grain coffee from that morning came up first, then bile, then nothing. I stayed bent over for a while. My hand against the metal was trembling hard enough that I could hear my wedding ring tapping the strut. Except I haven't worn a wedding ring in 11 years, so it must have been my knuckle. I straightened up. I went back through the row because I needed to count. 19 hosts in this hold. The ship had carried 300. The port technician, Griggs, told me RTG 1138 had been in maintenance for 16 days. I had managed enough supply chains to understand what happened to the other 281. They were offloaded, moved to other vessels. The transport ship was just a shuttle. The incubation happened elsewhere, on the dedicated ships docked at the restricted inner harbour, behind security tiers that my logistics clearance did not reach. 300 per year. 30 years. I could do that math. I did it standing in that cargo hold next to a boy who was watching me do it, because his eyes were the only part of him the enzyme hadn't taken. 9,000. I walked out of the hold. I signed out at the port security checkpoint. I took the collaborator transit back to the administrative zone. I walked to my apartment in the senior housing block. I did not go back to the office. I did not go to work the next day. I filed a medical absence notification through my terminal, the first I'd submitted in over a decade. Then I sat at the table in my kitchen and ran the numbers. I skipped the grand total. I'd already made that calculation. 9,000 was a number too large to hold in any useful way. I ran the operational numbers instead, because that was what my brain knew how to do. Transport capacity per vessel. Estimated incubation cycle duration based on the developmental stage I'd observed. Turnover rate, fuel, maintenance, personnel allocation for a continuous incubation operation sustained across decades. I built the logistics profile of the thing I'd been feeding paperwork to for 30 years because logistics was the only language I had, and I needed a language to think in that wasn't screaming. Then I pulled the records for RTG 1138's cohort. All 300 files had changed status at departure from in transit to obligation fulfilled. There was no field for return, hospitalization, or recovery. I drafted a provisional disembarkation order to see where the system would route it. The terminal rejected the order before I could submit it. Custody transfer complete. Destination authority, outside human administrative jurisdiction. I tried the emergency protocols. A human logistics coordinator could quarantine contaminated cargo, suspend a vehicle, delay a district intake. A human logistics coordinator could not classify a Tithe selectee as medical cargo once custody had transferred. That required Protectorate biological authority. Any request I filed would go to Seoul's office, where the 19 people on RTG 1138 would become an access violation with my name attached. The harbour allocations told me the rest. 3 permanent berths, rotating maintenance windows, intake capacity scheduled months ahead. The vessels themselves were the program. The paperwork ended at custody transfer because the system treated each host's human life as finished. Documentation could delay the next shipment by hours. A completed transfer lay beyond its reach. I needed something the system could not reclassify. The incubation ships were in the restricted inner harbour. My clearance reached the port's general areas: receiving, maintenance bays, cargo operations, equipment storage. The inner harbour was above my access tier. The docks where the larvae became viceroys inside living human bodies were above my access tier, but my clearance reached everything around those docks: supply lines, equipment routing, depot manifests, maintenance scheduling. I managed the strip mining demolition supply chain. Had for years. Thermal cutting charges. Compact, high yield, designed for precision excavation work in the mineral extraction sites outside the wall. I'd signed requisition orders for them hundreds of times. I knew the inventories and depot routing. I knew which shipments were large enough that diverting a portion wouldn't flag a discrepancy on the weekly audit. The tools of my complicity were the tools available. There was a neatness to that which I didn't enjoy. Ambrosia created the practical problem. The biometric compounds in my bloodstream registered on every passive sensor in the administrative zone. Every doorway, every corridor junction, every checkpoint logged my identity when I passed. If I entered the inner harbour with active compounds, my name, clearance tier, rank, and precise location would be recorded on a security log that someone eventually reviewed. The tracking compounds fell below sensor threshold about 6 days after a missed weekly dose. Door permissions lived separately on my clearance token because most human employees carried no Ambrosia at all. A valid credential would still open what it was authorized to open without the passive system identifying the body carrying it. The treatment's repair effect was slower to leave and less orderly. Once that failed, 25 years of deferred aging would arrive on a timetable beyond my control. My last clinic appointment had been 5 days earlier. My next was scheduled in 2 days. I missed it. 6 days after the missed appointment, the veins along my jaw lost their luster. The iridescence faded to something flat, waxy. My hands ached when I made a fist. On the 7th day, the edges of the veins darkened. Grey first, then something closer to charcoal. The pain in my hands spread to my wrists, my elbows. I slept for 11 hours. On the 8th day, I went back to work. The veins were visibly wrong, dull, darkening, the colour of a bruise that won't heal. I wore my collar high. My face in the mirror that morning looked like a man who'd been sick for a week, which was close enough to the truth. I accessed the demolition supply chain records from my terminal. A scheduled shipment of thermal cutting charges was bound for strip mine 14, routed through the eastern depot inside the wall. 96 units. I modified the manifest to divert 12 to a secondary equipment depot that serviced the port facility's maintenance operations. The modification was within my signing authority. Routine reallocation. The charges would arrive at the secondary depot in 4 days. Dennis noticed. He came to my office mid-morning carrying his tablet as cover. He opened with a scheduling question while his attention kept returning to my collar. The District 4 alternates. Do we hold them at the processing centre or release them back pending confirmation? Hold them. We don't have confirmation on the primary selections yet. He didn't leave. His gaze stayed on my collar, then moved to the skin above it, where the veins showed despite the fabric. David, is everything all right with your treatments? Batch contamination, I said. The clinic's adjusting my protocol. It'll clear up. I've never seen that happen before. It's rare. He wanted to believe me. Voluntary refusal of Ambrosia by a senior collaborator fell outside the system's assumptions. A contaminated batch therefore seemed more plausible than the truth, even though the truth was written on my neck in necrotic black. "Let me know if you need anything," he said. Sol's operational review was at 1400. Unavoidable. I sat across the desk from my alien liaison, wearing my high collar, feeling the ache in my joints deepen every time I shifted my weight. Sol's sensory apertures fixed on me. Coordinator Palmer, transit schedule for the incoming cohort. The schedule is complete. Intake begins in 10 days per the current timeline. The timeline has been revised. Intake begins in 6 days. Operational adjustment. Docking preparation for incubation vessels will commence in 4 days. 6 days, not 10. The window had been cut nearly in half. Sol gave no reason. My rank left me without standing to ask. "I'll update the transit schedule accordingly," I said. "Your appearance has changed, Coordinator." I kept my hands flat on the desk. "Minor treatment irregularity. The clinic is addressing it." Sol studied me for 3 seconds, then tilted his head slightly. "Your explanation is acceptable. Confirm the revised intake schedule by end of day." "I'll confirm the revision by end of day." He left. I sat at my desk, inside my office, inside walls cast from the melted rubble of a city I'd never known, with a street sign that said Porter Avenue 2 feet from my head. 6 days. The charges would arrive at the depot in 4. My veins were dying. My body was beginning the long process of becoming what it actually was. 58 years old. Most of those years had been spent sitting at a desk, signing paperwork, avoiding the walls. 4 days to receive the charges. 2 days after that to get them into the port. 6 days total. Success required Dennis to leave the clinic records alone, the audit cycle to miss the diversion, and my hands to keep enough strength for the detonator. I pulled up the transit schedule on my terminal. I began revising it for the 6-day timeline, because that was my job, and my job was the only cover I had remaining. The morning the charges arrived at the secondary depot, I couldn't button my collar on the first try. My fingers had stiffened overnight, the knuckles swollen, the joints grinding when I forced them closed. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, working the button with both hands, watching 25 years of deferred aging surface at once. The treatment had held me at 35 for over 2 decades. 12 days past the missed dose, the debt was coming due all at once. My jaw had softened. The skin under my eyes had gone slack. The veins, jet black now, branching from my throat past my jawline toward my cheekbones, made me look like a man with ink spreading under his skin. I got the collar buttoned. It covered maybe half the damage. 2 days until the new cohort loaded onto the incubation ships. The thermal charges were sitting in the secondary equipment depot 6 blocks from my office. I had scheduled myself for a routine supply inspection at 1000. The inspection was legitimate paperwork. Everything I did from here on out would be legitimate paperwork, because paperwork was what I understood, and I intended to ride it as far as it would carry me. The depot was a low concrete building inside the wall, servicing the port facility's maintenance operations. Mostly unmanned. I signed in with my logistics clearance, walked past racks of mining equipment, found the crates from the strip mine 14 diversions stacked on the receiving pallet exactly where the routing schedule said they'd be. 12 thermal cutting units, each about the size of a thermos, packed in foam-lined cases. I'd handled requisitions for these charges for years. Compact, high-yield, remote detonation capable, designed for precision rock cutting at extraction sites. I transferred them into grey composite containers that matched the standard port supply format. 4 cases, 3 charges each, procurement labels printed from the depot terminal. Then I generated a supply requisition for Port Docking Bay 7, replacement drill components for a strip mining hauler under maintenance. The requisition went through my office authorization. I signed it myself. The containers would be delivered to the port's general receiving area by end of day. The pull order, the document authorizing retrieval of those specific containers from port receiving, I wrote for myself, a logistics coordinator collecting a shipment he'd ordered. The most ordinary transaction in my professional life. My hands ached from gripping the cases. The joints in my fingers felt like they'd been packed with sand. Dennis found me in the depot lot as I was walking back to the tower. He must have tracked me from his office window or asked someone where I'd gone. He was carrying his tablet, official cover, but he'd come to have a conversation he'd been putting off. "David," I asked Naismith at the clinic desk. He stopped about 15 feet away, looking at my neck and the black veins climbing past my collar. I kept walking. He fell into step beside me. "You haven't been in for almost 3 weeks," he said. I'd been waiting for that sentence. It meant my cover had a shelf life measured in hours now. The Protectorate pulled me from the standard protocol. They're running a separate panel. It's above clinic-level clearance. A separate panel. That's what I said. Dennis shifted the tablet to his other hand. He said nothing for a few paces. Around us, the administrative zone went about its morning. Transit vehicles, uniformed staff, the slag glass towers catching the light. The dark shapes inside the walls stayed at the edge of my attention, where years of practice kept them. "You look like you've aged 15 years, he said. "I'm aware of what I look like, Dennis." He turned the tablet toward me. My Docking Bay 7 requisition was open on the screen. The description said replacement drill components. The source commodity code belonged to demolition inventory. "This crossed my queue because it overlaps the intake preparation schedule," he said. 12 thermal cutting charges routed to the port under a drill parts description. "The transfer is authorized by you. I authorized it. Is there something you're not telling me?" There were several thousand things I wasn't telling him. Validate the schedule conflict and close the exception. His grip tightened on the tablet. "You're asking me to clear a false description. I'm telling you the shipment is inside my signing authority and outside your operational lane. If you elevate it, Sol's office freezes every port requisition attached to the intake cycle until review." A review would freeze the requisitions exactly as I had said. Dennis knew the procedure as well as I did. "Finish the revised intake schedule," I said. "Make sure District 4's alternates are cleared. That's what I need from you." He stopped walking. I didn't. He could route the discrepancy to audit from where he stood. The alert would reach Sol before the containers reached receiving. After a moment, I heard Dennis's footsteps resume, heading the other direction back toward the tower entrance. The Ambrosia veins at his throat had caught the morning light as he'd turned, vivid blue-green against his skin. The mark of a man who still had time. By 1400, the containers were in the port's general receiving area. I confirmed the delivery through my terminal. Tomorrow morning, I'd retrieve them. After that, success depended on my body lasting long enough. I spent the rest of the afternoon revising intake documents for a cohort I was planning to prevent from ever reaching the ships. The 2 District 9 alternates whose substitution order I had signed on Tuesday now appeared in Loading Group 2, medically cleared, transport confirmed. The system had absorbed them without friction. I added one more item to the port schedule, a high-energy umbilical load test on the restricted pier, 11:30 to 1200 the next day. Standard safety protocol required non-essential human maintenance crews to clear the 3 cradles during the test. The entry was true in every field except purpose. I assigned the test to equipment already scheduled for calibration and signed the exclusion order. Filling out forms I intended to make irrelevant had a quality I couldn't name. From inside the work, it felt like the job, the last version of the job. I entered the port facility the next morning at 07:30, carrying a maintenance carryall and my pull order. The security checkpoint logged my clearance token. The biometric sensors stayed blank. Nearly 2 weeks past the missed dose had stripped the tracking compounds from my blood. The token recorded my entry when I presented it, while the corridor grid received no passive signature between doors. I was a grey-haired man in a logistics coordinator's uniform with black veins crawling up his neck. Port workers kept their eyes on their tasks, following the habit of avoiding collaborator-class staff. Under these circumstances, I was grateful for it. I collected the 4 containers from general receiving. The pull order matched the requisition. The receiving clerk, a young man, maybe 22, no Ambrosia, checked the documentation, checked the container seals, then set the first case on the verification scale. The terminal flagged the weight against the listed drill component class. 2.6 kilograms over specification, he said. Composite mounting collars, I said. Field retrofit. The variance is covered under the source requisition. He looked for the attachment. There wasn't one. The system offered him two choices: hold the shipment for engineering review or request authorization from the signing coordinator. I was the signing coordinator. He turned the terminal toward me. I entered my clearance and accepted responsibility for the variance. The warning disappeared. The scale had measured the case correctly. The documentation had told the system that the correct measurement did not matter. The clerk handed the containers over without another word. He had the kind of face that could have been on a Tithe roster. I picked up the cases and walked toward the maintenance access corridor before that thought could finish forming. The maintenance access code for the inner harbour. I'd pulled it from the operational database 3 days ago using my supply chain verification clearance. The database listed it as a standard maintenance credential. The code opened the pier gate. The inner harbour was separated from the main port by 200 metres of restricted corridor. 3 vessels sat in docking cradles along the restricted pier, large transport-class ships connected to the pier's power systems by heavy umbilical lines. Unlike RTG 1138, these were permanent installations. Incubation ships. I entered the first ship through the forward cargo hatch. The carryall weighed maybe 20 kilograms with the charges inside. My shoulders protested the load. 2 months ago, 20 kilos was nothing. Now my body registered every gram. The platform rows stretched the full length of the vessel, hundreds of them, recessed into the deck, each one occupied. The hosts in this ship had been here for months. The one nearest the hatch was a young man. What remained of his torso had been rebuilt around the thing growing inside it. His ribs on the left side had been forced outward, the bones bent into new angles by weeks of pressure from the expanding lava. His abdomen was distended, the skin pulled tight over shapes that didn't belong to any human body. Through the stretched tissue I could see the segmented mass of the lava, dark, dense, easily 3 times the size of the specimens I'd found in cold storage on RTG 1138. His internal organs had been displaced and compressed. The larval body occupied most of the cavity, curled inside his ribcage the way something folds itself inside a shell it's outgrowing. His arms had wasted to almost nothing. Skin draped over bone from shoulder to fingertip, the muscle consumed. His legs were the same. The organism drew what it needed from the extremities, eating inward toward the core. His face remained pale and sunken, recognizably that of a young man who had once been healthy. His eyes were open. They moved when I moved. Since the last intake cycle, he had lain on this platform with only his eyes under voluntary control, while something ate him from the sternum outward. Fully aware. The enzyme kept them aware. Cruelty might have been the wrong word for the design. The enzyme kept the host's autonomic systems running, which kept the tissue viable, which kept the food supply fresh. The awareness was a side effect, an engineering outcome, a detail omitted from every manifest I'd ever signed. I opened the carryall. The charges needed to go at structural weak points, anywhere the blast would propagate through the ship's frame rather than dissipating into open space. The same principles I'd reviewed in demolition placement reports at the mining sites applied here. I'd spent years auditing those reports. Now the knowledge was worth something different. My hands made the work slow. Securing a charge meant pressing the adhesive pad flat against the mounting surface, then locking the magnetic clamp. Both steps required grip strength that my fingers could barely produce. I positioned the first charge against a fuel line junction near the engine compartment. The clamp engaged on the second try. I paired it to the remote detonator, a standard mining trigger, compact, already armed in my coat pocket. The pairing signal confirmed. I placed 4 more charges through the engine bay, working along the fuel distribution manifold. My right hand cramped on the 4th. I had to set the charge down on the deck, flex the fingers until the cramp released, pick it up again. The entire process took me nearly twice as long as it should have. Around me, the hosts lay on their platforms. Some of their eyes tracked me. Most stared at the ceiling. I forced my attention away from whether they had lost even that movement or exhausted the will to use it. I moved to the second ship. This one held a more recent cohort, maybe 6 to 8 weeks into the process. The larvae were smaller, the deformation less advanced. The hosts still had some muscle mass remaining, though the torso distortion had already begun. Ribs starting to spread, abdomens swelling. The trajectory was identical. Only the timeline differed. I planted 5 charges across the fuel junctions and engine housing. The last 2 went onto structural supports along the hull. My left hand had gone partly numb by the time I finished the final clamp. I dropped the clamp and had to kneel to retrieve it from the deck. Kneeling put my face at platform level. The host in front of me, a young woman, maybe 20, watched me from 18 inches away while I picked up the clamp with fingers that barely closed. On my way out of the second ship, I saw the intake tag. Every platform had one, a small stenciled panel at the foot with the host's identification data. I designed the tag format myself 12 years ago when I standardized the Tithe documentation system. District, name, intake year, reference number. The reference number below the name placed Thomas Powell in batch 03 of year 49, document 338. I knew that batch. My name was on the authorization chain for every document in it. My signature moved Thomas Powell from a population registry to a transport manifest to a docking allocation to this platform, where a larval viceroy was restructuring his ribcage from the inside. I looked at Thomas Powell. He was looking at the ceiling. His eyes weren't tracking anything anymore. The third ship, the vessel Soul's revision had designated to receive the incoming cohort, wouldn't open. The access code failed twice. On the second rejection, the hatch panel displayed the reason: pre-intake biological lockout. Its credential rotation had taken effect at 0600 that morning, 4 days earlier than the original port schedule. Under the 10-day timeline, the ship would still have been under standard maintenance access. The same acceleration that had forced me to move before the charges were audited had sealed the last vessel before I reached it. I tried a variation using a secondary maintenance prefix. The hatch panel rejected it. Forcing the lock would make noise in a harbour where any sound carried across the water to the main port. 2 ships. I had rigged 2 of 3. I walked out of the inner harbour. My vision had blurred at the edges over the last hour, a softness that turned distant objects into suggestions. My legs felt heavy, the muscles in my thighs degrading under the Ambrosia withdrawal's accelerating timetable. I signed out at the port security checkpoint. The guard waved me through without looking up from his terminal. The walk back to the administrative tower took twice as long as the walk to the port. I stopped once to rest against a transit barrier, breathing hard, feeling my joints grind with each step. I was 58 years old. For the first time in 25 years, every step felt like 58. I sat down at my desk. The Porter Avenue sign was 2 feet to my left, the same as always. The shapes in the glass, rebar, concrete, the outlines I'd stopped examining 2 decades ago, held their positions in the slag glass like specimens preserved for study. My office, my walls. The mining remote was in my coat. I took it out, set it on the desk beside my terminal. Standard issue detonation trigger for thermal cutting charges, operational range of 2 kilometers. The port was 800 meters east, well within range. I opened the restricted pier schedule. The umbilical load test exclusion had begun 6 minutes earlier. Human maintenance badges had cleared the cradle zone except for 1 electrical crew at the Western Service gantry. Their task log showed them beyond the blast line, separated from the first vessel by the reinforced fuel control block. Protectorate biological staff remained aboard the ships. The schedule did not identify them as personnel subject to the exclusion. The two rigged vessels held more than 500 hosts between them, if their platform capacities matched the harbour allocation records. The third could accept most of the incoming cohort alone. Fitting the remainder would require capacity stripped from another cycle and a slower schedule than Sol's acceleration allowed. The District 9 alternates were in Loading Group 2. I had put them there. The hosts in those two ships would die in the detonation. I'd calculated that before I'd calculated anything else. They were months into a process that ended the same way regardless. The charges would finish it faster. Whether that was mercy or convenience, I didn't have the luxury of deciding. I had the luxury of choosing which bodies the schedule consumed first. I armed the trigger. The indicator light shifted from amber to green. My thumb slipped off the recessed switch. I set my wrist against the desk to hold the hand steady and pressed again until the light stopped blinking. I pressed it. The sound reached the tower about 2 seconds later. A deep, single concussion that came through the floor hard enough to rattle my terminal against the desk. The slag glass flexed in its frame. Then a second impact arrived, different in texture, heavier, followed by a rolling vibration that travelled up the wall and through the bones of my hand. Fuel stores detonating. Through my office window, I could see black smoke climbing from the port district, lit from below by something bright. One of the pier umbilicals tore free and fell across the service deck. A docking cradle sagged toward the water. The second vessel disappeared behind flame and smoke before the first emergency vehicles reached the outer gate. The fuel fires would spread through the shared lines, loading equipment and power distribution, damage that would take months to repair. The third ship was still there, intact. Untouched on its cradle at the far end of the pier, its pre-intake lockout lights steady through the smoke. The Protectorate's emergency signal activated through every speaker in the administrative zone. 3 short pulses, gap, 3 short pulses, repeating. I'd heard it tested twice in 30 years. I'd never heard it used for real. I sat at my desk. The smoke was still rising. The surviving ship could absorb only part of the incoming cohort on the accelerated schedule, and the destroyed pier would delay whatever came after. A disruption. That was what I'd managed. A disruption in the production schedule, accomplished by a man who'd spent 30 years making sure the production schedule ran without disruptions. Other cities had their own programs. Other ports, other ships, other cohorts managed by other men sitting at other desks in other slag glass towers. New Geneva's capacity would be rebuilt. The Protectorate had rebuilt everything it had ever lost. That was the nature of the thing. It was larger than one city, larger than one port, larger than one logistics coordinator's belated crisis of conscience. Dennis came through my office door. He stopped just inside the frame. The emergency pulses were still cycling through the building's speakers. Smoke was visible through the window behind me. He looked at my face, the black veins, the skin that had aged 20 years in 2 weeks. His eyes went to the mining remote on my desk, the green indicator still lit, then to the smoke. "David, what did you do?" He took a half step back. I set the remote down. My hands couldn't hold it steady anymore. Something that should have been done a long time ago, by someone better than me. Dennis stayed in the doorway with his tablet under one arm. The Ambrosia veins at his throat, vivid, iridescent, alive, caught the emergency lighting. "They'll come for you," he said. "That was inevitable. You're dying already, aren't you? The withdrawal is killing me." His free hand went to the veins at his own throat, touched them, then dropped. Some men spent their whole careers inside a building without looking at the walls. Sol's communication came through my terminal. His image filled the screen, the smooth, dark faceplate, the paired sensory apertures. "Coordinator Palmer, 2 incubation vessels have sustained catastrophic structural failure, internal detonation, thermal cutting charges consistent with strip mine operational inventory." He listed the evidence: missed Ambrosia treatment, supply chain modification on the demolition manifest, equipment routing to port general receiving, port facility access confirmed through visual security review. This represents a significant operational loss, he said. The surviving incubation vessel retains partial intake capacity. Replacement hull allocation is already in review. You were a productive resource for 30 years, coordinator. For 14 years, every exchange had ended with acceptable. This one ended in silence. My body was finishing the work the withdrawal had started. The ache in my joints had moved deeper than muscle, into the bones themselves. My vision had narrowed, the blur at the edges creeping inward. I had days left, maybe less. Either the Protectorate's security teams or the collapse would reach me first. The outcome was the same. The Porter Avenue sign was still in the wall, 2 feet from my head, the same bent green aluminum, the same white letters sealed in slag glass that had been poured from the rubble of a city I'd never known. I looked past the sign, deeper into the glass, at the shapes I'd stopped examining during my second year in this office. For the first time in 19 years, I made myself see them. The compressed arc of a ribcage, the curve of a skull, a hand, fingers spread, suspended in the glass at roughly the same height as my own hand resting on my desk. I'd been sitting 2 feet from that hand for 19 years, filing transport manifests, signing intake documents, adjusting my collar before walking to the transit station, going home, coming back, every morning, every year with a dead man's hand pressed flat inside my office wall, right there, the whole time.